Our next topic in the course will discuss Asian American women and family formation, and even the second generation that will emerge, especially when we discuss Japanese Americans, that is to say, the Nisei. And we'll discuss this history through the first half of the 20th century. And by now in the course, we should have a basic idea, a basic picture of Asian migration that occurs before World War II. As you know, it's mostly male because of men being the preferred gender to perform this type of labor for Western industries. However, as long as Asians have been migrating to the United States, there had always been women migrants, however, smaller in number. Now, of course, just because they were less in number doesn't mean that they're therefore less significant, needless to say. So, with this lecture topic, we're going to fill in the gap there. That's been kind of absent so far in our lecture topics. So, we'll discuss again Asian American women and also families, as I just mentioned. Now, one thing you likely did not realize before this course is how profoundly gender shapes migration. And this is especially the case, historically speaking, when we discuss Asian American immigration to the United States. That is to say, specifically for Asian Americans, gender has been a determinant factor in terms of who can come, who could go. It shapes the very conditions of immigration in this history. So, one thing I want to emphasize here at this point in the course is how the migratory routes traveled by Asian Americans to the U.S. were indeed gendered routes, as mentioned here. So, what do we mean by this notion of, quote, gendered routes? Well, basically, it refers to the fact that the migratory pathways that were carved out in the Pacific, like moving originally from east to west and then even back and forth, well, those migration routes have been profoundly shaped by gender, right? And then when you think about, comparatively speaking, other immigrants that were coming in, especially from Europe and even other parts of the world, it wasn't the case that gender profoundly shaped those routes when you compare them. So this is what we mean by in the Asian American immigration experience. It's profoundly shaped by gender, hence gendered routes. Now, I just mentioned what is probably the obvious reason behind this, and that is to say the preference for males by Western recruiters or American recruiters due to physical strength. But we also have to acknowledge other factors besides that. We have to recognize cultural, moral, and economic reasons that are found both in the place of origin of these migrants and the place of relocation or place of new settlement. And of course, that means the U.S. West. So let us first discuss the case of Chinese women and Chinese gendered routes when we think about immigration. And let's first focus on their place of origin. Of course, that's China. And one thing you cannot ignore in this history is the patriarchal nature of Chinese traditional culture. That is to say, pre-modern China, of course. And just in case you're unfamiliar with the term patriarchal society or patriarchy, which is mentioned here in the slide, well, this refers to a society that's dominated by men. And typically within that society, women hold these secondary status. So they're relegated to these subsidiary positions, if you will, compared to men. And that's the nature of traditional patriarchy in China, as well as other patriarchal societies in the world. Okay, so this was indeed the case with the Chinese women in or during this time in China. They were indeed restricted not only in their relations to men, but also in their place in society. That is to say, they had very little mobility, very little autonomy and freedom within their society. So, this patriarchal nature seeped into traditional culture and society, even politics and economics, and it became calcified as tradition. For example, in terms of family, from childhood, daughters were considered less desirable than, sons. So you were considered more lucky if you had sons rather than daughters. And indeed, girls from a very young age were taught to serve men and to eventually bear children, and that's basically it. And once they became of age, if you were a quote unquote respectable woman, you did not travel far from home because, as I mentioned, you don't get to enjoy a sense of individualism and autonomy, especially compared to other cultures that you may consider less patriarchal and less restrictive. So, really, when we think about mobility, and obviously this ties into migration, right? Women being restricted to migrate around China, let alone across the Pacific Ocean, right? Well, the only females and women that actually left their ancestral villages were these girls from destitute families, very poor. And often, and tragically enough, they were sold as either servants, like indentured servants, or as prostitutes to work in, let's say, the larger towns and cities. Now, was this condemned? Actually, no. It was actually quite widespread for impoverished families, those who were suffering from economic destitution, to resort to selling their daughters as indentured servants, or perhaps into concubinage, which means a concubine is basically a secondary wife, right? And it was practiced back then in traditional China, let alone being sold into prostitution. Now, what about the daughter's free will? Did they have any say in this? Well, not really. Of course, there's going to be girls who rebel and defy this, but for the most part, these girls were performing this out of filial piety. They were performing the role, I should say, out of filial piety. And basically, filial piety means complete obedience to your parents, right? Which again is traditional. So, in a sense, they were powerless, and perhaps they were too young to understand what was really going on. So they just obeyed here. So, based on tradition, women were inculcated with patriarchal tradition, binding them to this subservient behavior and attitude. As I mentioned, they had little autonomy and little independence. And to make this more complicated, much of this was reinforced by traditional Confucianism, which placed women in this subordinated role to men, both within the family and in society itself. For example, with regards to the role of the daughter in a family, here was a Confucian maxim. It went like this: as a daughter, obey your father. As a wife, obey your husband. As a widow, obey your son. So, obviously, in all phases of life, in all the relationships that you have with men in your family throughout your life, you're always in this subordinate position. Now, even outside of family, in society itself, women were taught to occupy the spaces that were really not social spaces. Okay, they were discouraged from, being in public places. They were taught to stay indoors while the men occupied outdoors, right? So when they were in social spaces, it was often segregated by gender. Okay. If women, again, were discouraged from actual mobility within their own society, as I just described, imagine the notion of women traveling overseas, right? It almost seems outlandish from that perspective. And just to reinforce this further, here is a slogan, or more of a folk saying. This is a Chinese folk saying, quote unquote, a woman's duty is to care for the household, and she should have no desire to go abroad. So there we go. Women were discouraged from achieving any type of mobility. They were encouraged to stay home in the household, as the slogan went, or the saying went. And again, you can imagine their lives as being profoundly bounded by patriarchy. Okay, so we've been discussing those factors that shape the gendered routes connected to tradition and patriarchy. What about the issue of practicality? Well, yeah, let's put culture aside and look from the Chinese practical point of view. And when we look at it from this perspective, the notion of financial practicality emerges, namely in these respects. First of all, it was less costly to sustain their families in the homeland in China than in the United States. So this especially applies to the well-off merchants, right, and their wives. Sometimes they decided that the wife should stay in China and be with the family because it was more practical financially speaking. And this ties to the second reason, that the Trans-Pacific fare was quite expensive. Okay, so this actually factored in their economic calculus, if you will, as to whether or not the wife should actually migrate to the U.S. And again, I'm referring to the merchant wives, right, who could afford this. By the way, this brings up the interesting question. Well, how did the poor sojourner, the contract labor, how did they pay for the fare when they left Guangdong province? Well, usually it was paid for in advance, and then it was deducted from their wages, right? That was paid to them, and usually it took quite a long time for them to pay that debt. Okay, so that's how they got there. Now, another reason, this applies to poorer families. Well, it was fully understood that women who migrated could not expect to find work in the U.S. because, the nature of work in the U.S. West, as we described it, was, industries like the cattle industry, mining, railroad, agribusiness, and, women did not have a place in this economic niche. Now, again, going back to merchant wives, here's another reason. They led quite comfortable lives in China, so therefore, why even move, right? So they might just decide to stay in China because they live a life of leisure and comfort. And the fifth reason here is, in view of the fact that the Chinese began to experience discrimination and even racial violence. Many Chinese families considered those conditions on the other side of the Pacific in the U.S. West as too unsafe for women and children. So this discouraged them greatly, and they said, well, it's probably better to stay in China due to the danger that might emerge should they decide to migrate there.